Winnipeg Free Press for bringing us all together on a regular basis to discuss so many fantastic local books. Thank you, Katie, for hosting, and thank you to all the viewers at home and to everyone who submitted questions. And of course, thank you, Seyward, for joining us and for writing the wonderful book that brings us all together tonight. As an introduction, Seyward Goodhand is a remarkable and original Canadian writer whose stories have appeared in many publications such as Found Press, Riddle Fence, Cosmonauts Avenue, Subterrane, Prism International, Grain, and Dragnet. She has been shortlisted for the McClelland and Stewart Journey Prize, a National Magazine Award, and longlisted for the CBC Short Story Prize. Originally from Ontario, she now lives in Winnipeg, and I'm so grateful that she moved here. First, she has been a great friend of McNally Robinson Booksellers, a fantastic host herself for any book launch or discussion, and a wonderful addition to Winnipeg's literary community. I always look forward to hearing what she has to say, and I'm confident that any discussion she is a part of will be fascinating. Not to put any pressure on this evening. Second, I am also personally grateful for her move to Winnipeg because it's meant that for the last several years, I've been lucky enough to be in a writer's group with her and to have participated in many discussions with her about fiction, storytelling, and countless other topics, which I'm sure you can all start to imagine based on the incredible number of ideas and subjects featured in the collection we're discussing tonight. Even That Wildest Hope came out in 2019 and was a finalist for the Margaret Lawrence Award for Fiction, the Eileen McTavish Sykes Award for Best First Book, and was longlisted for the 2020 Sunburst Award for Excellence in Canadian Literature of the Fantastic. The collection has been described as daring, deeply unsettling, complex, inventive, mysterious, intelligent, and astonishing. Returning to this book in its entirety for the third time has been an experience that has reinforced all of these descriptions for me. I've also found myself impressed all over again as I've discovered new layers, meanings, and tensions to both the individual stories and to this rich collection as a whole. That ability to be new even when familiar, to continually offer readers more with every return visit is, in my opinion, part of what makes this collection a truly remarkable piece of literature. So without further ado, I'll happily turn the virtual microphone over to Seyward Goodhand for a reading from Even That Wildest Hope.
Well, thank you so much, Joanna, and I'm so grateful and happy to be in a writing group with you. Joanna's a wonderful writer and a most excellent reader and editor as well, and I just have loved that I've gotten to, that we get to be together in that group for the last few years. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you everyone for coming. Thank you to the Free Press. Thank you, Katie. Thank you, Joanna. I'll read from The Fur Trader's Daughter, the first few pages. My father, Hephaestus Rolfe Knox, was a trapper and a taxidermist. He said that when he made me, he had formed my personality, as all fathers do with their children, based on a thought he was brooding on at the moment. That thought was, if she's bad, I can melt her back down into wax, for I am alone as hydrogen and as plenteous in my power, and no one can stop me whatever I decide to do. When my father caught himself thinking this, he became angry. He'd wanted to make a daughter he could trust by imbuing her with compassionate, loving thoughts, and now he could never trust me. But I am pleased he thought it. That's the thought that gave me patience. For many years he and I lived on a lake in the woods. There, all we knew of time was the sun rising and falling over a ridge of cedar across the water. That and a stopped pocket watch my father kept on the mantel. Once a month we journeyed into the city for provisions. The city was an old woman with a million eyes. When we walked through her gray, cobbled streets, dragging suitcases glutted on pelts and the stiff heads of beasts, I sought out light through the smooth towers of windows soaring over us. Open your curtains, I said, open your eyes. Shut up, father said. Stop treating the city like it's alive or I'll reduce you into a giant candlestick. But this is something I liked to see at the time and still do, sources of light. And the city does feel alive because it is bright, it moves, and it will never leave its childhood behind, no matter how hard it tries. Our shopping list was always the same. Arrow T55 staples, non-putrefying wax, shoemaker's thread, surgeon's needles, wadding, newspaper, plaster of Paris, arsenical soap powder, flour for father's waffles, artificial eyes. Day or night, the market never closed. Hundreds of stalls sat under gray paper lanterns strung between rooftops so thickly they made an artificial sky that kept out the rain. At our stall, we sold the usual savage icons craved, my father said, by a certain kind of suburbanite, like wild boar tusk and polar bear grizzle. But mainly our customers wanted softer fare, items imparting luck or wisdom like rabbit foot or wood owl. If they liked to pretend they came from another time and place, they bought martintail and ermine snout. Women talked about plucking their brows fine and buying red lipstick to go with their new muffs. We sold more than enough to get by. I watched the people in the market and they watched me. Most of them were city people, unlike my father and me, who had traveled from across a wide space. Infants and their transitional objects, my father sneered, rubbing his hands together. He tapped his nose mysteriously. When these cyborgs get bored of those little safety boxes in their pockets, that's when they come to us. Other traders hawked beige lampshades printed with purple half moons, underwear that said, "You'll love me for lunch," bowls of addictive bag puffs people could eat all they wanted of and never gain a pound. There was a man who sold udderless cheese made from pig milk, and a family that traded in dragon fruit. Every time we went to the city, my father had a dragon fruit, and each time he squinted as if in pain and said, "How can something so beautiful taste like nothing?" Friendship interested me most. I watched shoppers hold hands, brush shoulders, laugh at each other's jokes. None of them came near where I stood because they were afraid of the bees that hovered around my cloak. Still, I overheard. "She doesn't look real. Did you see that her skin has that grafted look? She has to walk behind him. It's like she's his slave. Does he lock her up? Did he burn her?" "Hey, you," my father would say over his shoulder if he also heard them. "Keep your chin down and don't look at anyone. Don't give them a reason to look at you. I am the law." I am the law. You're a walking, talking bar of soap. I spoke to no one but him. My father bartered with potential clients, and I counted out their change, bagged their boar, antler, or bear claw, and kept my eyes on their pockets. At home, when he felt fond, father called me Little Buff Duck. But because I was always the same, obedient, quiet, and inexpressive, I could never predict when or why he'd experience a surge of affection. I did not like it when he called me Little Buff Duck. Both of us knew I didn't really have a name, and it was sad, very sad and pathetic to pretend that I did. Thank you.
Thanks for that reading. I didn't know what which story you were going to choose, but I'm really glad that you chose that one because it's one of the ones that has haunted me most since I read it. The line of "that's the thought that gave me patience." I have not been able to stop thinking about that, so I'm glad that you chose that to read to us. But I think that sort of segues well into a question that I had that I know some of our readers had as well, which is sort of where you draw inspiration from. Just in this collection, the stories jump through so many different styles, so many different places and times. Sometimes it's not immediately clear whether we're in the past or the future or some combination. And like I said, so many different styles of writing here. So where do you draw your inspiration from for a lot of these stories?
Oh, thanks, Katie. Probably, if I had to summarize where I'm drawing it from, probably two main avenues. One is from actually personal experience and people that I know, which is somewhat masked in a collection like this, which is not written in a realist mode. And because of that, I feel that I can you know, kind of go full bore at certain experiences or the way. I mean, no experience in this book has literally ever happened. I don't want to suggest that, but some of the characters are based on people that I know, and because they're so disguised, because this mode isn't real, I feel free in myself to explore those experiences and those feelings. So there's a kind of translation, like emotional translation, that can take place when you move something, like a real feeling from life or a real experience, a real relationship, into a different register. And it gives me a kind of feeling of freedom, like I can get out of my own way and actually see it a bit more objectively. So that's fun. And then often from other things I've read, I'm inspired by things I've read. So this book is quite literary, by which I mean it's within the literary tradition. It's inspired by other works of literature a lot. My first title for it, my first idea for a title was Afterlives, and my idea was that it was going to be like the kind of afterlives of various forms. But I chose a different title instead. So with this book, probably those two things I read, and then actually real, there's a lot of emotional kind of real truth and real life experience in here translated.
is there a particular something in particular that drew you to sort of exploring some of the, I guess, darker parts of human nature in this?
Other than my temperament, I don't know. Yeah, I'm really compelled by the grotesque, and I'm thinking this through right now, what that means, and what the grotesque even is as an aesthetic category. And I think what I like is the combination of something that's kind of dark and disgusting and simultaneously attractive, and you sympathize with it at the same time. And there's this kind of vacillating back and forth, push and pull feeling, like something kind of like often organic, uh, often maybe not human, like a rotting mushroom or something like that. So not human, but something that's like both gross but also compelling, and you just want to keep looking at it and is fascinating. So that's just temperamentally what I'm drawn to. Probably deeply rooted in childhood somehow. I don't know. I don't know why. I'll blame my childhood. But I like I think I feel a kind of expanded sympathy or sensibility when I can try to draw close to things that are also dark and disgusting. So it's not really with the ambition to critique exactly that I'm drawn to the dark, but to kind of like expand my sympathy if I can. Uh, you know, but it involves disgustingness, I think. Yeah.
That's interesting. So you find more of a freedom in that than, yeah.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Yeah, it probably comes down to a certain freedom. Yeah.
There's some parts of it that I almost thought of as I was reading it as kind of like picking at a pimple.
Yeah.
like like it's a bit disgusting, but also satisfying.
Yeah.
And it was fun in a way too. I mean, some parts are kind of disturbing. We were talking just beforehand about the Gallantrax must die, and some, but also really fun to read these tales. And I see a lot of the inspiration that you mentioned that draws on literature. Is that you've studied English? I mean, is that part of your? But how much of I guess past works do you want to bring to your work? And sort of, I'm interested to know where does that make it more challenging for you to draw on something that already exists and lives in the world and make it your own?
Not with this book. I guess that was often what I was inspired by with this book. And I think, like a lot of writers, I like rewrite in various ways and capacities. And stories are so, the stuff that inspired me and the stuff I like the Epic of Gilgamesh, for example, which is, a big reference to that in the first story. There's enough. On the one hand, they're so capacious, these old stories, but there's enough holes in them that you can fill in the blanks, and kind of step into a world and inhabit it. And I feel like I'm co-creating it. So with this book, no, I was quite inspired by those other works, and imagining, the story from a different perspective, or just imagining the world in a more expanded way than the original was able. That this ancient story carved into stone was not able to give much detail, right? So then I just felt compelled to step into it and sort of flush it out. And sometimes it's helpful having those structures there. A lot of I'm teaching a Shakespeare course right now, and he is a big rewriter, and it allows him to kind of explore a theme or an idea or a character trait. Often, an odd kind of character trait, and he's got a kind of structure available to him, and then he can really, really look closely at a certain kind of character within that pre-existing structure. No, it's something I like doing sometimes. I'm not currently doing it in what I'm working on, but I do like rewrites.
It's interesting that you decided to title the book as you did. You said you had considered afterlives, which I think is interesting. Can you explain more about where the title came from, and how? I think readers wanted to know where the hope comes from. Where does it tie in?
Yeah. Well, the title is from a Ruth Stone poem, And it was a Ruth Stone poem, and even that wildest hope that we might meet beyond the grave is the continuation of that line. So it's this hope for something, that there's, hope is different from expectation or certain knowledge, or you know or some sort of, or any kind of certainty, right? So it's a hope for something, maybe improbable, but that you're aligning yourself with anyway. So the collection is dark, but there's still probably, I mean, the last line of the book very intentionally was, for better or for worse, I kept us human. So that's somewhat where the hope lies, is, is there, what does it take to just commit to the idea, say, that every small life has value, which they do. Even the life of the poor Galatrax in the Galatrax story, or these poor, strange fictional creatures. So it's kind of, I know these stories are odd and they're not immediately connected to reality, and I still wanted to try and give them life, and so it's sort of connected to that. Can small, weird, eccentric little things, idiosyncratic things, still have value?
And I think, just in my reading of it, I'm not an expert, obviously, but the way that you were able to infuse that humanity in every story, in all these, even the creatures that you're inventing, I think, that really comes across clearly. And so when you get to that last line of the Hansel, Gretel, and Katie story, it all just comes together. What does Gretel say? You just said it.
Oh, for better or for worse, I kept us human.
I kept us human. And I think that's what struck me as, in the way you described now too, the freedom of creating these creatures to really bring us back to the humanity. So I wanted, if we could get into a little bit of nitty gritty, if you don't mind, of
the
process of it, because I'm really interested in how you so economically have created and fleshed out these whole worlds in some of these stories of, how do you decide, I guess, I'm wondering how much what the creative process is like. How much of a world and of a character do you build up that's just going to be background that you don't even necessarily include in the story?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it really varies from story to story. I'm glad you think these are economical, because that was one of my sort of anxieties, is that these are like not economical enough. But this differs. So some stories, like the Galatrax story and Hansel, Gretel, and Katie, I wrote really quickly. And I think it's because sometimes I think of it as like, definitely finding the voice of the story matters, finding the groove of the story matters. So those stories just sort of took off, and I was able to add density and detail, relatively. I edited them obviously, but like in the first draft, they kind of came together, and I wrote them probably in a few hours, both of those stories. Other stories, like Enkidu, took me years to write, and there was like gazillions of words that didn't go into this story, that fell away as I was trying to find the plot and the structure of the story, and it just kept expanding. It was like this giant foam machine or something. It just kept expanding. And I was able to sit down and always write in this world, but I wasn't sure what the shape of the story was, and I really had to find that over a process of 2 or 3 years with that story. So it really depends on what happens. Yeah, it's kind of like going into a lab, as an analogy, and like, you're doing experiments here. You're trying to get something to work, or you're playing around, and sometimes things work, and sometimes things take a lot of work, to find and to excavate the story, to find that through line. Yeah.
I find personally editing is often the hardest part. Making something really short often takes the most amount of work. So I'm interested in, some of your shortest stories in the collection of, I don't know if it's too sort of technical, but maybe you can explain how you decide sort of where to drop us in, sort of where to start the story, where at which point you're going to drop the reader into the world, and where you're going to end it. And specifically, I'm wondering about, Felix Baumgartner's Guardian Angel, where how do you decide that this is the end? And I think that's also what I was thinking for What Bothers a Woman of the World, sort of the ending is sort of what how do you decide that this is the end when you've created a story?
Yeah, that's a good question with those, especially because those stories are so short, right? And I knew they were short as I was writing them. I knew they had that feeling of being the size that they were, and so I was pushing them towards something. And I guess in those cases, the ending being pushed toward is kind of like a little moment of revelation or something like that, you know. Um, I'm thinking of the what bothered the Egvagvat story, What Bothers a Woman of the World. It's sort of the narrator is trailed by this creature and feels a lot of contempt for this creature, but then comes to a sort of understanding where she understands something of herself mirrored in the creature. So there's a kind of revelation or shift in her perception. Um, and so something has to change, I guess. At the end, the story has to change, especially in those examples. In terms of where to begin, I don't know. I mean, sort of finding the beginning for me enables me to write the whole story. Like finding the rhythm of the first line is my way into the whole thing. Um, so if I can find that, if the certain like pitter pattering rhythm of a voice comes to me, then I can kind of keep going. But again, some of the stories I rewrote the beginnings and edited them and restarted them a number of times. So it did. I mean, ideally, it's nice to just like begin with not too much backup, unless you're aiming for a kind of tailish, wide of scope thing. But you want to kind of begin right away. Oh, another kind of technique is to begin with your character thinking of another character or engage somehow with another character, so they're not just beginning like alone, too far away from anyone else in the story, alone in a room, but engage in some kind of friction.
Mhm.
Yeah.
We have a sense that there has been, a lifetime before this, or maybe not a lifetime, but a period of time before, and there will be, time after. And I think that's part of the world building that you're so good at creating in this collection. If I could, I wanted to ask you, I came across a reader's guide in which you had imagined some of the questions that you'd like to be asked about the book,
Oh,
which I should note are much more intelligent and well poised than the ones that I had ready to ask you.
no, I might regret these if they come up now.
But as part of that, you wrote that you think that self-deception is the most dangerous thing in the world. And
Yeah.
I thought that was very interesting. And I wondered if you could maybe explain that and sort of how you see your responsibility as a writer or your role as a writer to get that across.
Yeah, I guess I feel this way because I've been so self-deceived so often. So I feel and then I'm sure we all have, right? There's like, you go through phases of where something has been repressed or that you've been just or you've forgotten something or buried something or something, or you refuse to acknowledge something, and then coming to that realization of the thing that you've refused to acknowledge feels can feel pretty humiliating, if not even apocalyptic sometimes, but in a good way, like in a revelatory way as well. So why do I think that, like beyond writing, but just in general about life? I think part of it has to do with my relationship with my parents, I think, and with my relationship with my mother. My mother, when I was younger, she was quite into, and we've talked about this, so if I'm happy to say it in public. I'm writing about it right now. But she's gone through phases of being quite addicted to pyramid schemes. And so when I was growing up, I would see her kind of fall in and out of various schemes. And as she was in one, she would suddenly adopt a new way of speaking, a new kind of system of belief almost overnight. And then maybe a few months or a year later, she'd pop out of it again, you know? And so seeing that a few times, you know, and my mom's smart, you know, she's smart. Nonetheless, there must be some kind of desire in these that these things are offering her, right? And the desire is so strong that she's willing to temporarily shut down her, you know, critical faculties for a while. And so seeing that, I mean, I suppose has been pretty impactful. And then I'm always on the alert for, you know, when I'm doing something like that, right? Whenever if I'm in periods like that. So that's probably where that comes from.
So is the goal then, do you think, to not be deceived, or just to know that you're being deceived?
Well, maybe eventually to know when you're being self-deceived. Yeah, I don't know if there's any way around being deceived or self-deceived sometimes. You know, we have these minds, right, that are like helping us to extend out of ourselves and communicate with other people, but then also they can backfire and they can block us from other people and create these little, you know, uh, moats that separate us. So, I mean, it's a quite the organ we humans have to navigate with. Yeah.
One of the things that I was thinking about that you had written about it is sort of how we you were talking about self-deception in the way that we deceive ourselves about our hopes and our loves, I think is what you had written. I just wondered if, you know, there's an aspect that you've already described to this collection of stories that, you know, part of the goal, if I'm, you know, in my humble interpretation, is you're trying to unsettle people in a way that, you know, the discomfort is necessary here, is part of the process. And we talked about sort of maybe perverse satisfaction that comes from some of it. Do you get the same sort of feeling as a writer? Like when you've written these stories, is it the same? I guess if I maybe am not being articulate, but the way that you want the reader to feel about the story that you've written, is it the same sort of feeling of satisfaction that you get as a writer?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think yes. I think yeah, I do. I think like these stories, I guess I find them kind of darkly funny as well. Some of them, you know, the moments that are gross can also be kind of funny. Not all of them. But yeah, I do want that. You know, yeah, I think ideally there would be, if the writing's going well, there is a feeling of pleasure and freedom. And that is the feeling that I would want the reader to have as well, right? That we're kind of, I mean, I don't think these stories are terribly transgressive, but they're transgressing in odd little ways, and they're little like moments of play or moments of freedom, but also moments of, you know, moments of, there's a certain maybe morality, but not like a dogmatic, principled morality, more of a morality rooted in sort of idiosyncrasy and freedom, you know, paying attention to those little eccentric moments is what brings me pleasure. And then I hope the reader would feel pleasure from that too. Yeah. And I feel pleasure when I read stuff like that. Like, I think you like Shirley Jackson too, Joanna. I
Yes.
don't know. Yeah, I don't know if Katie and Erin, you like Shirley Jackson as well, but she's a writer like this, right? She's like, she's hilarious, right? She's hilarious, and she's dark and you know, and psychologically turgid and convoluted and all these things. But there's a real impish kind of mischievous pleasure that I feel when I read her.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree. She also had an interesting relationship with her mother and an interesting history with her mother, I believe, as well.
Yeah, that's right.
And sort of speaking of relationships, that tied into one of the questions I'm continually interested in when reading some of these stories. I think first of Enkidu, but I'm very curious about the relationship between the self and the other, the tension between self-awareness, which I think can tie into self-deception, which you were talking about earlier, recognition. So I was just wanting to ask, how much of your characters do you think depends on their relationships to others? There's the clear divide, or are these malleable lines going back and forth?
Yeah, that's really great. I hope that what is happening is the characters are sort of defined in their relation to others. But often I'm interested in exploring alienation as well and feelings of alienation. But it's the relationships that are interesting to me, and the kind of even alienation in a relationship is interesting to me. But the characters are definitely defined by each other. Yeah, I mean, even just as even just technically writing, it's kind of hard. Or I would find it hard anyway to write something where there's actually just one brain in a locked room, you know. um I don't know if I've ever read anything where that is the case either, you know. It's kind of what we're exploring here are relationships. Yeah, and in Kidu, that story, you know, he's immediately competitive and ambitious and wants something for himself, and is kind of like learning through this kind of mimicking of this like amazing demigod guy, Gilgamesh. Um, so yeah, I think the relationship is the key thing. And in the Galatrax story, I mean, it's just a weightlifter, an unnamed weightlifter, and an animal that she's devouring. But there's something very relational there. And one of the moments I was building to in that story is this moment of kind of perverted intimacy, right, where she's eating the Galatrax, and its face kind of rests against hers eventually, and then she feels like she's the Galatrax, right? So there's this like, you know, exchange of identity and kind of intimacy that goes awry. So yeah, I'm interested in intimacy, I guess, and relationships. Yeah.
That was one of the things that I noticed too about this, and I think that might be why, well, I don't want to speak for other people, but that might be why some readers would find it more disturbing, because of the level of intimacy that you've been able to infuse in the stories. It wouldn't be it wouldn't touch us to that level if if it wasn't so, if the intimacy wasn't so layered there and crafted. So and I just when you talked about the humor, I think that comes through as well, you know, even in the line that you were just reading about the dragon fruit. I wondered if you know, certain moments of dialogue like that, does that, you know, are you inventing that completely, or are you taking that from inspiration from you know, real life?
I'm inventing it completely, and it's really fun. So I used to be scared of writing dialogue. I think when I was years ago, I was scared of it, I think, because it feels so naked and exposed. And it's, you know, the closest to drama that's in this fiction, you know, in this medium. But it just felt like, you know, the character's naked and barely exposed out there, you know. And I would think, oh no, like this is the moment where something has to really happen. They're really revealing themselves, or I can't, you know, I can't describe anything. My narrator can't do anything. All of these other apparatuses of fiction have to be disabled. And then I discovered that I loved it, writing dialogue, and I really see it as like, I love it when dialogue has a kind of like flyaway, kind of free feeling of being connected, not connected to the scene, or when characters can really reveal themselves in a kind of free, playful way. But yeah, I'm definitely. It feels like pure invention sometimes in a way that is very, very fun. Yeah, and I like it when the, you know, it's nice when the dialogue isn't too on the nose, and, you know, as in like doesn't, you know, advance the plot or something too on the nose, right? Like we must go to the store now because we have to get to the next plot point or something, you know. But you know, moments where the character can really reveal themselves freely and reveal themselves to you, to the writer and to the reader, you know. Yeah.
I have some reader questions, but I just wondered if, Joanna, do you have any other questions that I've been talking too much to let you get to?
Well, I'm kind of curious as to what was the time period from drafting some of the first stories in the collection to the last, and I have a follow-up question to this.
Okay, yeah, no, some of the stories are kind of are older. Like the Fur Trader's Daughter, I wrote it in 2011, I think, so that's quite, it was kind of older. But then I rewrote it for this collection. So in its first version, when it was published in Prism, it was a different, it's the same
Hmm.
story, but quite different from the way it is now. So I rewrote it. And then oh, when I was really sitting down and putting this book together, probably 3 years or so. But some of the stories that I was working with were older than that, that I was then reworking with and rewriting. So yeah.
Okay. And so it's like most of it was done when you were living in Winnipeg.
Yeah,
Split.
yeah, yeah, maybe half, maybe more than half. I don't
Yeah.
know. Yeah.
But I'm kind of curious to know if you noticed any kind of effect or shift in the change of location would have had of your work. And I'm kind of thinking specifically of the story, The Gammons of Winnipeg, which I'm assuming was inspired after you moved
That was,
here.
yeah,
Yeah.
that one was
Um,
inspired here. Yeah. That
yeah.
was inspired by that creepy little spidery water tower. It's maybe not creepy, it's just a little water tower, but out by St. Boniface. Uh,
Mhm.
yeah, it was inspired by that for some reason, just like the driving by that a few times. Um, yeah. So yeah, that one was written here. The last story, Hansel, Gretel, and Katie, it takes place on the prairies, and there's a lot of Mennonite surnames, but it was not written here. I wrote that one in Toronto, but my partner's a Mennonite, so I was, uh, you know, vicarious, and he's from Winnipeg, so I was distantly inspired by Winnipeg when I wrote that one.
Okay.
Um, did they change? I don't know. I
Yeah,
don't know.
I'm sort of interested in the effect a place has on somebody's writing. I know another writer who thanked the city of Winnipeg in their acknowledgments for having an effect on them that they claimed no other city ever could. And so, as a lifelong Winnipegger who has heard many ruminations on the unique qualities of the city, I'm curious to know, as someone who has moved here, what kind of an effect it may have had
Right.
on you, on your work.
Well, one effect is very material, and that is that the city is affordable, and you can be a writer in it more easily than the city. So there's just a like non-literary. I think all writers should move to Winnipeg unless they're independently wealthy and aristocrats, then they can live anywhere. But if they're not, this is a great city to live in. If you're an artist, I mean, a lot of other cities are just far too expensive. And there's a great community here too. So it's had a real big effect in terms of that, right? In terms of just like the world outside of the actual fiction materially. I was able to write the book because I was in Winnipeg, devote myself to it because I was in Winnipeg. And then in terms of something a bit more emotional or spiritual, I prefer to write in kind of like a bunker space, like windowless, a windowless bunker kind of space. So, or like on an airplane or like somewhere in a non-space. So I don't know. I actually try to, I think of place when I'm writing. Um, and certainly Winnipeg has lots of oddness about it. It's a David Lynchy kind of place. Like lots of odd things are always happening, and that's inspiring. But I kind of like when I'm actually writing, I like to, I'm not looking out the window.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm curious, was there a particular reason why for the Gammons of Winnipeg that you decided specifically to set it in Winnipeg?
Huh. I just think, I guess maybe at the time, so many odd things were happening that we'd seen around us, just like outside, little incidents that um, we were affectionately calling the people who were doing these odd things gammons. And then, and then, and then I just felt inspired to write this story about them. About again, I probably a prevailing theme here would be freedom, but these creatures, these characters who are just like living a little bit apart from the order of things, right? And are just carving their own path and finding their own system of value. So maybe it's a place that can kind of feel like that. It feels like a little bit set apart. And it's in the middle of a big space. Um, it's got a kind of long-standing, not that I was thinking consciously of this, but it does have a long-standing um, relationship to all of those farmer co-ops. There's lots of co-ops here that we don't have in Ontario to the same degree, other than in farming towns. And so there's a kind of like, maybe history of finding one's own way, in a little community, in a surrounded by space. So maybe kind of an anarchic quality that I like, but that's a grab. That's a grab.
We had a reader question wondering about the cover of the book, and if you could explain what's the story behind it. Did you have a lot of how involved were you in the development of the cover?
Not very involved. So yeah, Megan Fields is the cover designer for Invisible. She does all of the covers for them, and I think this cover would have been inspired by the story The Parachute. And maybe combining the story The Parachute with Fur Trader's Daughter, but in that story, um, um, there's a there's a kind of murder by cutting of a parachute that happens, and she cuts the parachute into a flower shape. And I thought the kind of like sickly green medicinal color of the face captured something about the overall feeling of the collection quite well. And then, yeah, I guess a moment in that story struck her, so that was what she chose for that. I had say in liking, she did a few, and then I could pick one, but yeah, she's really great. She's a really, yeah, creative person, and she's just doing her own thing. The cover artist, yeah, it's pretty cool.
So many different parts of, I guess, the process of putting a book together. I think that we don't often have a lot of insight into every little step of the process. Was there something about that you could share about the editing or the process of putting this book together that maybe you'll take with you, or that you'll hold on to as you keep, working on your next books?
Something about the process. Well, I guess because this is a short story collection and I'm writing a novel right now, I guess something I would think about more is like how to make. I'm thinking of coherence and cohesiveness now, because all these stories, as you said, are so different, and they do go together. And there's an order to the stories. Um, to the beginning and end of the collection, but I'm thinking a lot of the book as a whole, I guess, in a way that I wasn't when I was first setting out to write these stories. But that is something that you learn as you're editing a book, is to sort of step back and see the thing at a larger scale, and not just thinking per story or per line, or how do you think of this book as a whole? What are the cohesive threads? What is the coherence here? So that is. Still something I'm learning in the making of a book, but that's really important, and something that you don't really start doing until you start making a book, right? You start thinking of the book as a unit.
Yeah. I actually have a quick question about that sort of ordering process. So I used to be a music reporter, and I would ask musicians all the time about their album sequencing, specifically like openers and closers. And I was wondering how you decided what order these stories were going to go in, if that was a process that you worked with your editor with, or if you were the one kind of leading the charge there.
Yeah, so it was a mixture, and we had like lots of conflicting ideas. So I think we knew the story that we wanted at the end, because we wanted that last line, and then there was some, sort of conversation about what we would put at the beginning. And the conversation circled around, do we want to ease the reader in with a story that is a bit more accessible than this like, Mesopotamian novella? Do we want to ease the reader in, or do we want to kind of begin more thematically with some of this like beginning of history, problem of humanity kind of questions? And we really went back and forth with that and had some discussion and even argument about that. And I feel like we kind of like both of us were going back and forth, the editor and I, and then we just had to pick something. So we resolved, we went the thematic route. but it's hard ordering the stories, definitely. And there's different there's a kind of pragmatic way of doing it, which is to ease the reader in, that kind of way, and then there's a kind of more thematic way of doing it that's maybe less pragmatic, and that's the one we ended up choosing. Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. We are getting close to time, so I just want to do kind of a last call for questions for Katie and Joanna. So I will pass it to maybe Joanna if you have one more question that you want to ask before we go.
Sure. So I'm going to take this opportunity to ask about an image in one of the stories that I have not been able to get out of my head. It's in So I Can Win, the Galatrax Must Die, and it's not some of the graphic eating of the fictional creature. It's the image of the debris caught in the little girl's skirt at the end. And I was wondering if you could just say something about that, if it connects, how it connects to the story, maybe how it ties in just thematically with the whole collection, because I have not been able to get that out of my head.
Well, yeah. Speaking of endings, this is a story I really struggled to end. And this ending, you know, yeah, she's again, I think it comes down to a kind of mirroring and intimacy, but she comes out, she has this like weird intimacy, bad intimacy, by bad intimacy, I mean removing the integrity of one of the parties, with this Galatrax. And then she comes out and she sees a kind of mirror image of herself as a younger kid. The kid is like is wearing her dress, the same outfit that she's wearing, the same size and everything. And so it's her skirt getting kind of caught in the bike. And so, yeah, it was just a kind of moment of like, the weightlifter's very alienated, but is attempting to see herself everywhere. And this is all very felt out, not thought out, but but I think in the way that those images work, her relations to other people, or what she sees in other people, are kind of like reflections of a self, and that increases, I think, the feeling of alienation that she has. There's a feeling of kind of being like locked in herself, locked in her basement. So if I could venture a guess at that answer myself, because it was not, it was something I was sort of feeling through. That's what it is. It's kind of mirroring.
Yeah, well, it certainly resonates however you arrived at it. It stayed with me, and I can connect it grandly, but I'm not going to dare to do that. But I can also just connect it to the rest of the story. So it's really powerful, and I've been interested in it ever since the first time I read it. So thank you.
Oh, good. Well, thank you for noticing. Thank you.
Katie, do you have one more question that you want to ask before we wrap up?
I have, let me choose one. A lot of pressure to just have one last question. I guess I wonder if you've landed on any particular style that you want to pursue more, or that you are pursuing more, in your work now or in your next works.
Yeah, I don't know if it's a particular style so much as a particular tone or temperament. Yes, I want the voices to be a little bit mischievous, and impish. So, I'm working on two novels right now, and one is more like that than the other one. But kind of, they're both first-person narrators, both somewhat reflective, of experience, but they're both distorted. The first person narrators, and they're trying to have clarity reflecting back on what they've done, but they're both also very distorted, and that distortion allows them to be mischievous somehow, or to have a sort of impish quality. So I think there's a certain tone that I care a lot about, and I don't know if that will also means style. I don't know, but certainly the tone is something I think that matters to me.
Just before we wrap, sometimes authors like to plug their new work, or they don't want to talk about it, but I like to leave the door open if you want to talk about what you're working on now.
Well, I won't say too much. I'll just say I'm working on a couple novels, and one of them will be finished soon. That is what I'll say. Yeah.
Okay.
Crossing my fingers. Yeah. So I'll keep you posted.
That's awesome. Thank you all so much for that amazing discussion and for your time tonight. We really appreciate all your thoughtful conversation. I'm just going to end by mentioning next month's book really quickly because I'm losing my natural light here and I'm sitting in the shadow. So we have Thompson Highway's Permanent Astonishment next month. We're really excited to have Thompson joining us for a meeting. Literary editor Ben Sigurdsson is back in the host seat. I really hope you all enjoy this memoir. It's just like a beautiful piece of work and it's funny and it's deep and I don't know, I hope you really enjoy it. So that's for April. Just forgot what month we were for a second. And that's it for tonight. So thank you again, Katie and Joanna and Seyward, for your time tonight. And we will see all of our viewers and readers again next month.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.